for when Matt watches this later. Okay, so what I was saying is that we're going to run through the Roslyn C#6 samples with the exception of one of them. What the Roslyn page does is it just shows you the new language features without any real context of where you're going to use them or where you might come from. So what I've done is I've drawn up some examples derived from theirs of kind of a pre and post state of the new features you get in C#. So one of the interesting things, which you may not realize, is C# language features and .NET framework revisions are two completely distinct things, very, very separate. So I'm actually doing this in a Framework 4.5 project. I could probably go all the way down to Framework 2, I imagine, and it'd still work. Yeah. So the first and the most obvious things that people will see all the time are the things that they've done with auto properties. So you've probably seen classes like this before, right? Nice and simple. There's a lot of vertical space in there, so a lot of the themes in C#6 are making things that happen all the time a little bit more obvious. So this is what you may have had to have written, but obviously in this case, they've introduced property initializers. So ReSharper already has a refactoring for it. It doesn't suggest it because I think the verdict's out as to whether you'd want to do it all the time. But what you can do is you can do this. And then all of a sudden, your constructor disappears. So obviously the default constructor is still there, but simply because it can generate a default constructor, it just presumes that that's fine. So that's a nice, simple improvement that just reduces that vertical space. Nice and simple, nothing too posh. When you combine that with get-only auto properties, all of a sudden the case becomes a lot more obvious. So if you want to write a get-only auto property that you set in your constructor today, basically the syntax in previous versions of C# did not support public string get, because in that case nothing could assign to that at all. So everyone ended up in these patterns here where you had private member fields which you set in your constructor. And I mean, again, focus on the vertical space. We're looking at 18 lines of code here for nothing, for setting up two properties. So if I inline this, I can use get set. So that's a change in behavior right now. So if I do get and set, I can assign these properties external to the class. Remove these here. Do this. All of a sudden, that looks a lot cleaner, but the semantics have changed. So what Microsoft have done is they've said you can drop these here, and you can still assign to the properties from your constructor. So if you try and assign to them anywhere else, it'll break, I believe. So let's just verify that or learn something together. So if I try and say first equals, you get a big fat red compiler error saying you can't do that, it has no setter.
But you can initialize it.
Which is my next bit. So you can combine those last two features, and all of a sudden, again, when you're focusing on vertical space, that becomes a significant improvement on the mess that we started with out here. I really should have committed all this to Git before I started butchering it. Z. I'll go back to over, because I'll stick all this on GitHub later so you can push through it. So real simple kind of quality of life improvements that just make readability better. Interestingly, if you ever looked at F# and the kind of things they do in record types in F#, that's what Microsoft are pushing for here. Real skinny types that are mostly immutable, which leads us quite nicely onto the next bit, which is expression bodied members. So you must have seen this kind of stuff all the time, right? Absolutely all the time. You've got auto props and then some synthetic properties that are data backed, which concatenate or combine or do some multiplication. Basically, that's a secret function because you could just have easily have written a function called compute, compute name. So I could write something called name, and I could return first, last. Or for instance, full name M for method. And often you'll see when there's single returns in here, but the methods that compute the value are quite big, people will have private functions. So they have private methods here, which do the stuff, and you end up with properties that do things like this. Full name M. You'll see things like that around code, and the private method being buried deep down. What Microsoft have done is try to simplify this use case again. And it's another kind of F# inspired functional thing. You can use Lambda syntax. It's not actually a Lambda expression, it's just the Lambda syntax. So they borrow the, I forget what they call it, the arrow, the rocket, the thing I won't say on air. And all that really does is generate a method under the hood. Well, that specifically will generate a read-only get property. So if you look through it with the reflection API, you'll see it as an auto property with a getter and no setter. But again, all that really is syntactic sugar to reduce the amount of noise. They just say that the get is implicit and all those brackets and are a pain. And the reason they say that is because whilst I've done a nice little inline here, most people, when they do this kind of thing, will stick to language conventions that look something like that.
Could you still use a method there instead of doing that?
Could you still use a method there?
Go back to how it was. But you'll need a way of doing it.
Oh, okay. So if I come in here, I do that. Can you use a method there? Absolutely. And I'll show you that in the next sample. So this is what we kind of looked like before. If we jump to after, you can do something like that. So notice there's another auto expression bodied member there. So much like you can generate property getters, you can also generate effectively method signatures using Lambda-like syntax. Again, I don't think they're actually lambdas under the hood. I think they're methods that are generated by the compiler.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Could you have that as a property? I don't quite follow your question.
Like if you have,
As in, can I say...
instead of doing constant line,
Yep.
let's say you're doing something else.
Yeah, because that's just exactly the same.
No,
Because that's not returning a string. Yeah.
Void.
So yeah,
The return is implicit.
of course it is. So that'd work.
You can put a method, you can put
But all I've done is just turn that into a property. I turned that method into a property in front of you. So basically, you can define methods and read-only properties as if they're functional style little bags of data. The idea is a bit of history, I suppose, is Microsoft are working towards a records implementation for this version of C#, which is kind of crucial to F#'s type providers and things like that. They were trying to bring those across into C#, and they didn't quite make it. There are a couple of language features, I think it was default constructors, that they couldn't quite finish in time.
Yeah.
So they came up with a load of new syntax for generating constructors for you, but I think they must have run into some crazy edge cases somewhere where some code would compile differently, so they had to shelve it. It will probably come back, I would imagine.
It's worth noting that at this point for the expression bodied functions, which is that it can't be any old, it can't be any old function content. You can't put a block in there. It has to be something that
Single
returns
return.
a value, and the return is implicit, which is why you don't have a return statement.
Yeah.
So it literally has to be an expression.
Yeah, must be a single return, I think is what the spec says.
And so you couldn't have like an anonymous function.
You couldn't have an anonymous function in there. I
No.
doubt it, yeah, I doubt it.
You pass parameters in. You say print name.
I believe you can. Let's give it a string. Just like that. So, imagine the kinds of types that you can build out of this that are really, really terse little blocks. So say you've got little functional blocks of code that do mathsy things, for instance, like key use case, or things that mutate strings, visit classes. I mean, really, it's the same syntax you've always had, just expressed slightly more tersely.
Is it only one semicolon you can have after the symbol? So they,
Here?
yeah. So I mean, like, what I mean is, can you have multiple statements?
No,
That's
it's
why they're not. They can't be statements. They must be expressions.
Expressions, yeah. So the feature is expression bodied functions and members.
But if you had a more complex method below somewhere,
You could call it.
Curly braces to
exactly, you could call it. And the idea is that you could glue together some of these things. So yeah, if you combine, again, the auto assigned properties, you end up with a type that looks something like that, which is exactly functionally equivalent to that. And again, the visibility and readability is really what they're going for here. Right, okay, what's the obvious next thing? Let's do the easy one. String interpolation. Real easy to understand. Okay, David is awesome, honest. Again, another thing that ReSharper will suggest by default is new string interpolation syntax, which looks like this. So the obvious benefit here is all those horrible magic ones and zeros that you have to update and count your properties all disappear. So basically, this should have been in here from like .NET 1.1. It's amazing it's taken them so long to cram it in. It's probably to do with the way they do string interning inside the framework. We should just use that straight away because it's just better. And you look at ReSharper and you get syntax highlighting and really very good. And it supports escaping with doubled up quotes, doubled up curly braces even. So nice and easy, works everywhere. And yeah, the fact that ReSharper suggests it is good. In fact, I believe even in this original sample, ReSharper has built-in conversions and refactors. So move to assignment, and likewise in the expression bodied members sample before. You can alt enter here and go to expression body.
You do the same print.
To expression body. It's just not suggested by default because it's not necessarily always desirable. Okay, auto properties, expression bodies, get only auto properties, string interpolation. Null conditional is the other one that you'll probably find yourself using really often. So that is horrific. And that's a really, really obvious kind of use of code that happens everywhere. So the way that we normally rationalize this today is you'll extract methods out of these things and then you'll invert the top of the methods. So I'd probably do something like control RM, and then I go in here and then I'd invert this and then it'd look a little simpler. That's just a half step. So they should have kind of called null conditionals like destroying the law of Demeter or something, because what they've now supported is a syntax that looks like this. So actually, ReSharper also has some refactorings here that are playing in, so it's kind of hard to see. What a null conditional does is basically concatenate null checks. So that says, if the list is not null, then execute the next portion of the expression. So that is, if I replace that with its real type, is a nullable int. And it's basically saying, it's doing that check, then that, put a left one in there, and that. What ReSharper is saying here is these are grey because it knows the list isn't null, so you don't need to use any of these syntactical constructs. However, if you've got huge blocks of code that's doing things like model mapping, copying data from one place to the other, this will just make your code look nicer. As I was joking before, it does violate the law of Demeter where you're reaching into other things, internals. I don't know if you ever heard the don't touch my privates, right? Keep your hand off my privates is the kind of the pun. You shouldn't really be reaching down dot notation syntax deep into objects unless your objects are really, really thin and anemic and DTOs. However, there's a huge portion of code, especially if you look at like MVC websites, that are basically do something on my domain, get myself a model. Now let's copy loads and loads of data. And we should really use AutoMapper for this, but we're too scared of libraries or frameworks, so we're just going to do it by hand. So this will reduce a lot of the chaos and the noise in there. Beware overusing it, I would say, because I suppose the anti-pattern that I fear as people get more and more used to this piece of syntax is that people will stop being tight about the things that they accept. You should always validate your inputs. You should always break out early if you've got nulls. There will be a creeping habit to just let nulls seep through the system. And, it's no no great coincidence, the guy that first implemented nulls deems it as the biggest mistake he ever made in his entire career and one of the biggest mistakes in the entirety of computer science. So watch out for nulls propagating everywhere. Okay, cool. Save that. Auto property, get only. Let's do using static, because I actually really like this feature and I think a lot of people are not giving it as much attention as it deserves. So previously, if you wanted to use a bunch of static methods on a type, like say doing the cosine, my maths is so bad I don't even remember why I would do a cosine of anything. I know there's a button on a calculator for it. I'm sure it's very important if you're a graphics programmer. Awesome. I mean, I do that all the time. That's my hobby. It's my hobby. So you have to use the full syntax of math dot cosine. Okay, fine. So the simple example of what it looks like after is really try. All I'm saying is using static system.math. And then all of the static methods from math are now available inside of my classes. Okay, cool. Why would I use that other than something really, really maths heavy? So is anyone familiar with the phrase mixins, maybe from doing SAS or Ruby, right? So you could secretly use using static as a way to kind of use mixins in C#. So let me show you a different example, which I kind of like more. So I've got some kind of customer thing. And then instead of having base class inheritance for loads of utility methods that don't require any state, I have this print customer method. But this print customer method is actually defined all the way over here on some static helpers. So in all those places that you're kind of passing static helpers around or building big inheritance hierarchies just to do a little bit of work, actually you might find that using static gives you a nicer way to get that functionality in to keep the syntax really tight. Without any of the deep object hierarchies that come with inheritance. So
yeah, it's kind of everyone has using static my functions. There's just this massive
exactly a utility library, right? So obviously you got to keep things tight, but it's a similar kind of order of magnitude of feature as extension methods were. Right? Extension methods were really important to slimming down syntax and bloat, and I think this is equally as important.
I'd like to ask, which is in that particular scenario, why would you go for that instead of using an extension method that you go customer.print?
So you could, but I think it's a semantic difference more than anything else. You know, you can go for customer.print, and often I abuse extension methods and I glue them onto objects to get the nice syntax. But actually, I think you would use it more when you're saying this bag of methods semantically more sits in at the class level rather than the objects that I'm interacting with.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you could think of this as nothing more than extension methods for inside of classes rather than extension methods for the outside of classes. And the final one we have up here, index initializers. So you probably won't use these this often, but when you do. So one of the cool things that you've been able to do since I think C#3 is do collection initializers. So you can have a new list of string, and then you can go that works fine. But the gap has always been if you're using something that you need to assign by index. So you've got things like an array or a dictionary, like in this example. That syntax was never supported because you couldn't access the key portion. So what they've basically done with this feature is they've brought dictionaries into parity. So you can use exactly the same collection initialization syntax, but you can manually assign the keys and the values like this.
Maybe this will be in the code.
Yes, Code Dojo is where you want to manipulate arrays and matrices of maps and datas and 2D spaces. All of a sudden it solves a lot of problems. And similarly, again, ReSharper has refactorings and in this case it suggests that by default because it's just blatantly a better way to do it.
Really the best part of this is that you can get rid of, because right now when you want to initialize a dictionary, you've got to have that ugly key value pair thing being
exactly.
As well, so you can actually skip that completely.
Yeah, all of the, so you'd have to I wonder, actually, this is a good idea. If I make a dictionary of string, I wonder if ReSharper supports the refactoring, because you have to do this, don't you?
Yeah.
Which everybody, you can't do that. Everyone will always forget the syntax of, because it's horrible. So I'm surprised they don't have a refactoring to support that by default.
Yeah.
No, interesting. Might be one worth worth suggesting to them, because it is just a better implementation. Though ironically, if you refactor into add method calls, all of a sudden it'll suggest you do that. And it's because I'm not using the index notation, so those two things don't string together. It's a shame. And then the last thing that you will probably find yourself using, though a little bit less, are exception filters. So it's very, very hard to find a synthetic example for this. Normally, it's catch an exception. If something on my exception, log it to somewhere because I care about it. If there's an ID that's greater than 0, write something to a log file. Exception handling in all programming languages absolutely sucks. You know, Java tried to fix it with checked exceptions and they made it worse. C# tried to fix it with multiple catch blocks and that just sucked differently. This is yet another way to try and slim down this kind of horrible syntax where you're catching, checking some property, and then either throwing again or rethrowing. So horrible, ugly code. Or something that looks like that. So one of the examples that the Roslyn page lists, which is quite interesting, they call it a recommended hack, is to use it to do kind of flyby logging. So if a certain kind of exception happens in a certain condition, you can log and intercept with that while continuing your execution flow. So it's quite a nice way to say, hey, here is all my code that does my thing without any logging concerns. On the case of error, in this specific condition, log these things and then either rethrow or swallow. So I think this will probably be subtly more useful in a lot of places. I think the reason that we'll see this not be taken up as much as you might think is because I don't expect there to be any way that ReSharper will be able to suggest an auto refactoring. So you actually have to see it with your eyes, old-fashioned, and work it out. And I think.
So you can have anything else with, or
Where's the else?
yeah.
So bear in mind here, this catches, this just throws again.
Yeah.
So there is no need for that else because it just is never caught in the filter. So you don't need to throw it again if it's never caught. You could always write a filter that says not that. So for instance, if I had log something else here, something differently, I could equally do pop this block and say that. So it's just a way to stop you having loads of if, else, and switch flow control and exception handling blocks. I think it's basically an admission of the fact that exception handling always sucks and always looks crappy, and people do it too much. So if we can dry some of it up and separate the concerns out, at least exception handling will suck a little bit less.
I'm interested. If we looked at the IL to see if it genuinely isn't catching the exception when it doesn't meet the condition, or if it's catching all the time, examining the condition, and then rethrowing if the condition's not met.
I haven't, but I expect it does the latter, seeing as it's compiler magic. The runtime otherwise, yeah, and no, I imagine it's just generating one big fat try-catch exception with a switch statement. But like all this stuff, it keeps it out of user Lambda code, and anything that keeps all that ugly out of your code is awesome. If you ever do a lot of meta programming like me, or just throw a lot of exceptions, this is really, really handy as well. Proper tiny improvement. So traditionally, I'm throwing an argument exception. Argument is null. The param. I then change this to param2, and oh look, there's a bug. All of a sudden, my exception doesn't match my code. So the smallest possible change is the introduction of name of, and that uses an actual reference to the parameter. So if I do any kind of, that's not a valid name. If I do that, everything changes async. So obviously, ReSharper for years has had to write crazy synchronization code. So ReSharper always scans comments and string literals exactly because this is such an annoying bug. So they just put it in the framework. Obviously, you can use this in loads and loads of different scenarios. One of the things that you can do, another example of it, if I just have my class 2 public string sum prop. If I was to throw a new argument exception, in fact, let's do this as another method. If I was to throw a new argument exception because, say, if param sum prop equals null, if I do this, and this may or may not be desirable, I've not really decided yet. If I do this, this does work, but what will get written is sum prop rather than param.sumProp. So just bear in mind that if you're using this, you don't get the full fully qualified name. That's really useful when you're doing reflection stuff to provide helpful error messages, so that may be slightly worse in some cases. But to be honest, the number of you that will run into that exact scenario and it'll be a problem is probably very limited. Let's kill that. Oops. And I do believe that's everything. I missed anything?
But that's everything that made it in.
So those are your new features. Important takeaways, you can use them right now. We've now had the build server have the compiler upgrade put on. So you can compile .NET 2 apps with C#6 language features if you want, and it should just work. Obviously, if your team isn't all upgraded with 2015 and you check something in, nothing's going to compile because, again, it's a compiler thing. I don't think there's any language feature that they've added that I think is a terrible idea. The only thing I'd just say is use a little bit of caution with null propagation because it's just so attractive and it's so easy to use that you may accidentally back yourself into a corner and just have nulls everywhere. It's interesting if you read their rationale behind adding it because they know it's not a great idea as well. And the rationale was very, very simple. It's not a great idea, but absolutely everybody does it all the time anyway, and the code is terrible. So even though it's not a great idea, we're definitely making it a much better, worse scenario to be in than it was before. And that's probably the thing you'll find yourself using first. We'll go with that. All makes sense? Nice and easy?
Do we know if the old build server was updated as well, UK build 01?
I have no idea. Mark Goldsmith, I believe, did the story.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Can Visual Studio 2013 not run the new compiler, or does it just not have it all?
I think you'll have to install the build tools that you have to install on TeamCity and the build servers.
That's on my computer. 2015 should manage it.
Should.
Yeah, you should also have 2015. You shouldn't have any.
Yeah.
The only reason is event crunch. I'm stretching out my English trails. So
You get your own.
Okay.
my month is about to run out, so I'll move over in a day.
Let me stop my screen sharing. And
I'll come to you at CMIC.